Hello and welcome to this interview where I get the privilege of talking to my dad about his book, God's Treasured Possession. This is a fantastic new look at the story of Moses, and all kinds of lessons come out of it which are inspiring, challenging, moving. And I know from experience of learning these stories from my dad over many decades, but also recently reading this book, which is a wonderful summary of all the many lessons learned, that I've been helped, and I know it will be a great help to you as well. So looking forward to right now getting into this book with the author himself here today. So first of all, a very big welcome to you, Dad. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Joel. It's great to be here.
What I want to do to start us with actually is just on the theme of reading, learning, how we take in wisdom and knowledge. The Bible has a lot to say about seeking wisdom, and we're told that wisdom is more precious than anything else, and that it's appropriate to pursue the wisdom of God wholeheartedly. Your story involves a lot of learning over decades from different teachers, writers, people that have shaped you a lot in life, ministry, and your journey. But I wouldn't have expected, from what you've told me, that before your conversion you were a particularly bookish person. So this is something that kind of came in to your life after coming to Christ. Can you tell us a bit about that journey? Because I think that's a hugely instructive part for people. How does God change the way that we learn and pursue knowledge and wisdom? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's very true that before I became a Christian, in fact, before I became a kind of wholehearted Christian, I was a non-reader. I didn't have much time for reading. I'd read some stuff, obviously, but I wouldn't call myself a reader. But when I really felt I wanted to give my whole life to God, it was my experience that I used to be a commuter to London. I worked in London, and from Brighton, I had an hour's journey to work, an hour's journey home. And I started using that time. And so I began, I'm so glad that when I became alive spiritually, I was already attending a church, but an older lady, I think, spotted that I'd kind of come alive as a Christian and started feeding books to me. And the very first book I read was a book called Jungle Pilot about Nate Saint, who was one of 5 recently martyred missionaries. And I found that when I gave it back to her, she said, have you read this one? Jim Elliot and so on. And I found myself reading missionary biography, some of them quite up to date. Jeffrey Bull's story thrilled me. And then gradually back to people like Hudson Taylor. And I think I was introduced to reading by stories of missionaries whom I could identify with so much as a young guy and was so excited by. So that's what got me reading these biographies. I was an hour in the train going, an hour coming back. I still have the diary of that year. I used to keep a record in my diary of my winnings playing cards, which I used to do that before on the train. Now I have a list of all the books I read, 52 books I read in that year on the train. And I moved, I guess, from kind of stories, which took hold of me, to more devotional books. Andrew Murray was a guy I read quite a lot, Abide in Christ, Ministry of Intercession. I started reading books about prayer, Chadwick's book on prayer, other people's books on prayer, devotional books began to get to me. And then more, I think, it was a kind of a journey, more sort of theological books, Knowing God by Packer, The Cross of Christ by John Stott. And so I found I was catching up with years of church history, stories of missionaries. I was so grateful for that season when I could read and begin to appreciate things. And I began to get more and more interested in the church. I remember reading Watchman Nee, Chinese Christian, the normal Christian church life. I thought, wow, this is radical. And I found books stimulated me and helped me a lot. I still am reading all the time. I love I loved to read. It was a new thing to me, but it was very helpful.
I suppose that when you were a young pastor, kind of developing your thinking and working out the message that you're preaching and the foundations of church life that you're trying to build upon, both in the church you were pastoring and the other churches that you were serving, the kind of normal going idea about the church would have been in many places almost negative. Certainly a little bit more kind of incidental. It's like, what we're excited about is is the individual believer, the individual person becoming a believer and having an eternal destiny and security. And the church, well, we'll put up with the church. Whereas I know that obviously for you and many of your contemporaries around the time, we're talking, I guess, about the sort of 1970s time, there was a huge discovery of the importance of the church in the Bible. The kind of the biblical vision of the church gripped you. And you mentioned Watchman Nee. Could you talk a little more about how that theme came alive? Are there any other writers or voices that shaped your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I knew the need to develop my own and the individual's place in God. I read all the Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones stuff on Romans and Ephesians and so on. But gradually, this awareness that we are a corporate people and that Christianity is written to a people and not to individuals. And that to perfectly understand the epistles is written to a community, a people. And that began to fascinate me. So I read The Normal Christian Life, which was a very popular book by Watchman Nee. And then there came out this other book, The Normal Christian Church.
Normal Christian Church.
That's right, Normal Christian Church. Yeah. And that was radically different. And interestingly, because he's a Chinese guy and just coming from the Bible rather than from the history of Western church development, he just took it for what it was. Yes. And his excitement with the church really stirred me. He wrote another book called The Glorious Church. And I'd never heard anybody call the church glorious. The church you kind of apologize for. Yeah. And if you were evangelistically motivated, as I was, you'd say things like, well, don't look at the church, look at Jesus. Yes. That was very common talk. Yeah. Don't look at the church. But I thought, no, that's not what the Bible says. It's almost like seeing the church. You want to know the God that's behind the church. Yes. So I got quite excited about the church.
Yes. And this was a movement, I mean, in a sense. It was like, it seems like there was a whole army of leaders, I guess mostly young, but not only young, who made a similar rediscovery at a similar time, and churches were planted with that same kind of energy.
Yes, there was a new passion to start fresh churches. Yes. Because one began to realize, no, the corporate expression of being a believer was very, very important. Yeah. And so we needed to reflect that. Yes. I remember there was a beautiful musical thing that came out of America called Come Together. Yeah. And I remember there was a song in it that said, you are the people of God and he loves you and he's chosen you for himself. Yeah. And when they sang that out, I thought my heart would burst because I thought, yes, that's the thrill of the people of God. Yes. Yeah. And I think we began to see the church in a new way, God's treasured possession. Yeah. And
your first books, in fact, your very first book was very much a statement of that sort of prophetic message. You kind of, it was pretty full-throated, passionate cry for that kind of vision, I would say. Yeah. Restoration in the church.
Restoration in the church. I was very thrilled. It was well received. It was translated into many different languages. It was reprinted several times over. Yes. And it was setting out these kind of values,
Hard to get hold of these days, but worth it if you can, I would have thought. I mean, I know we've got a few knocking around in the library somewhere at the office, or we should have. But those kinds of things were being fought for. And I think some books are significant because of how they seem to sort of create a sort of, what used to be a ceiling becomes a floor.
Yes.
For the rest, for a whole hundreds of leaders and churches sort of found a place to stand, I imagine, because of books like that kind of help them to understand what it is we're building, what it is we're doing. And I know that was huge for many. With this book, we're talking about a very different genre. It's not built to a particular theme so much as it's built to a character, a Bible character. Which my observation, and I've obviously known you all my life, and watched the way you preach and do ministry. If there is a particular style of teaching that you seem at home with, it is character studies, teaching through the stories of individual people. And so I can think of many series that I've sat under that you've done, not just here, but in other parts of the world. But I've noticed that's kind of, it's not such a common genre today. I'm not seeing a lot of books. In fact, I don't think I've seen any recently coming out on the theme of a particular Bible character so much. I'm not quite sure what to put that down to. Do you have any thoughts on why that's not happening as much as it used to, and I think as it should?
Yeah, I think that the books these days seem to be either how-to books, or books on church growth. There are, of course, books handling the modern cultural issues, etc. I find for myself that people identify with the story, and I feel it's the way God has made himself known. And the Bible's like that. It's not a book of systematic theology. It's like how God related to people, and how they got to know him right from the beginning. So from the story of Abraham right on, when you're reading those early stories, Abraham, Isaac, it's almost like the gospel stories. It's like God talking to this individual person, inviting him to express faith. And somehow names of God have slipped in. The Lord will provide, the Lord who sees. And we're getting to know God all the time, but we're not getting to know God abstractly. We're getting to know God as it relates to these people. And they're proving God and learning about God. And that's the way God has been pleased to make himself known in the Bible. And so, I think we always benefit if we genuinely let the scripture itself speak, rather than impose a modern idea and somehow force it into Moses or Elijah or somebody. Let the Bible speak for itself. And we'll find God in these conversations and dealings, the disciplines, the disappointments, the encouragements, and you find yourself in the story. And so I think it's a very wonderful way of finding God through the story, because it helps us follow a story. It's very good for us. Television stories, week by week, episodes, they take us along. And the Bible's written like that. So, I love that approach. And I think we can find ourselves, we can identify with that particular hero as he's going through his experience.
Well, it turns out that this particular book is dedicated to Emmanuel Church, which is a huge privilege for us. It feels like a massive honour. Tell us a bit about why you've done that.
Well, it's fascinating because I was asked, do you want to dedicate the book? And I did an autobiography, which I dedicated to my wife. And I did a book on the Spirit-filled Church, which I dedicated to Nigel Ring, who was a dear friend. And I did one called Men of Destiny, which I dedicated to my 4 sons. And then I thought about it, and I thought, hey, the story, I first got into the story of Moses when I was involved in this church, and I was leading this church. And I felt God led me to Moses, because I felt he said to me, you're going to take these people on a journey. And we started as a very tiny little group. And so for myself, when we came to the lockdown, the coronavirus, and I thought, wow, what am I going to do? I felt immediately God spoke to me and said, it's time to write the book. And I thought, well, I thought immediately to go to Moses again. And I had worked a lot on the story of Moses when we were here working through it. And I felt God took us on a journey. And so it reminded me in fact, much of the work on the early chapters, I was able to draw from sermons that I'd preached. Nigel Ring always said to me, but you never finished it. He said, you left Moses in the wilderness. And I said, well, so did God. But actually, the book ends on the Mount of Transfiguration. Moses made it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to me, it was a very helpful thing to do, to preach. And we just took our way through. We were becoming a people, gradually gathering people being saved, people being added. The church was growing and growing and getting caught up on a journey.
Yeah.
And I really felt God helped us to take the story and one just turn the page and see what happens next. And I wasn't preaching every week at the church. I was often away. But when I came in, we always carried on the story of Moses. And it was just turn the page, see what happened next. And so many of the lessons that Moses had to learn and the people had to learn were massively relevant to us on our journey.
Yes, yeah. I remember, I think Pete Brooks used to joke that you took us into the wilderness but never got us out again. But I remember there were particular things like a gift day where we were raising money to pay for this building, in fact. And there was giving that was going towards that. One of the Sundays where we were giving, you were by God's wisdom were preaching on the gifts that came to the building of the tabernacle and things like that showed God's kind of involvement. But it's a privilege for us to have had that honour that it's dedicated to us. Many people who are watching this won't know how the church began and know your story in that. Perhaps you could say a bit about how things began here at what we would have called, I don't know, what, Brighton and Hove Fellowship, then Clarendon, then CCK, now Emmanuel. I've had a few name changes.
Well, yes, we started, I think it was 37 adults. We started in a school room in a school called the Connaught School.
Yep. I was there. I often say I planted the church at age 4.
In Hove. And we grew there quite a lot. And then we were invited to take over the Clarendon Villas building, which at that time was simply called Clarendon Church. It had been Clarendon Mission. I'd known it for years. I'd preached in it when I was in my early 20s, when I first started preaching. And it was a well-known mission hall, but it had shrunk in size. It had this history of having a massive children's work. And there are photographs lying around in that old building of children with the queue of kids, used to be called a crocodile, and the first lot had got to Hove Station and they hadn't yet finished leaving. That's how many hundreds of kids were caught up. It was a kind of a children's mission place. But by the time...
How did they get them all in that room?
I don't know. But by the time we were invited in, it had shrunk to about 25 people.
Yeah.
And so we came in there. And there was a load of work to done. We were given it free, but it had to be completely renovated. And so we began doing that and growing. And then gradually, we filled that place.
Yeah.
And the way we arranged it, we could get probably about 450 in there. And then we then grew, and then we came to here. So that's the journey that we came on. We changed names at various times, but that's been our journey.
And during that time, you were also serving a lot of churches in this region and a growing region who were churches that are either just starting or needing to restart. And it meant that gradually your involvement was kind of shared between the local church and this wider network that was really kind of brought together by your kind of fathering and oversight. Then that became much more of a team of churches, a family of churches with a lot of leaders working closely together, New Frontiers, which now is global, and we're talking, I guess, about 1,000 churches plus.
2,000 plus now. 2,000
plus. And it's kind of hard to imagine what you would have expected or imagined. I mean, in those days when things were getting started here, what would have been your expectations about that? Were you trying to create a movement? I don't remember you talking in that kind of way.
No, it was never in my thinking. I think we kept moving. People asked me, how do you start a movement? And I said, I don't know, we just kept moving. And then you look over your shoulder and you find, oh, we have a movement.
Yes.
So initially, we started house churches. I was simply invited to someone's home. And the people who gathered there, I was asked, would you come regularly? So I arranged to go regularly with a car full of guys. And then someone from that home moved to another town and said, would you come here? So I started going alternate weeks so I was going every alternate weeks to the different homes. They grew. In the end, I'm going to about 8 house churches. They grew to be house churches all around Sussex, all within like an hour's drive in an arc around the southeast. And they began to grow. And then we started hiring Hove Town Hall. Initially, we started at the Dudley Hotel, and then we went to the Royal Pavilion, the Art College, and then Hove Town Hall. And we were gathering about 1,000 once a month on a Monday night. And then we just began to grow. And then we started the Bible Weeks, initially at Plumpton, what was called the Downs Bible Week. And all the time, the number of churches growing and growing and growing. And then we moved to Stoneleigh. And there's a long story one could tell about that.
As you're describing, what I'm hearing is a story of God's faithfulness. It's less characterized by foresight and planning on a human level. I'm sure there's been a lot of that when needed and lots of wise people around. But the overwhelming issue, the overwhelming difference has been made by God's faithfulness. And God guiding, God leading. That would be your testimony, Owen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes out in the story, and it comes out in our experience that God is the initiator. In the story, you see Moses making his own choice initially. He has been, I think, given an amazing vision by his parents, who, in spite of being slaves, are captivated by the vision that they presumably inherited going back to Abraham. You're going to bless the whole world. And well, we're just a slave community. And Moses learning that, we are God's special people. Well, how can we be? We're slaves. And yet somehow, I believe his parents must have imparted that vision to him, because he then goes away to Egypt University, where there's a completely different value system.
Yes.
We're Egypt, and we're the biggest power in the world.
Yes.
And it's like so many young Christians.
Yes.
You've got this spiritual vision that your parents gave you, and now you've got this real, hey, there's a pyramid there, there's an army here, we're an amazing people.
Yes.
And he's got these 2 value systems. Yeah. And it says by faith, he owned the vision that Abraham had. I mean, it's wonderful, it's so exciting. But it's God who stimulated that faith in him. And then you find him trying to himself. You go and kill an Egyptian. You think, what are you doing? Yeah. And it's typical. We do stuff wrong. And so you see him blundering along at first. And then you see God's amazing faithfulness of waiting for him, caring for him, and then appearing to him. And now we're on a new day now. It's not Moses having a go. Yes. It's God coming. Yes. And that is so different. And that's where we need this message. God isn't looking for us to have a go. He's looking for people who have an encounter with him, and he takes over. Yes. And he's in charge. Yes. And all the time you see God's amazing faithfulness through the story. First of all, with Moses, blunders, disappointments, encounter with Pharaoh. What do we do? This is frightening. I can't do this. And gradually, Moses maturing and understanding, God's going to see me through this. Yes. God's going to do this. The fact that God's faithfulness is going to make this happen is so exciting. And gradually Moses learns to work with God. And Moses becomes so much more, he's like God's man. Initially he's doing it himself. And then no, it's God who's doing it. And Moses becomes God's man. And then gradually, Moses begins to have to encounter all the vagaries of the people and how they get it wrong, and they rebel, and they complain. And Moses has to reflect God's faithfulness, and yet you do still see. And there's one of the things that so moved me. I love writing it. I felt so moved when God says, I brought you on eagle's wings to myself. You think, you're talking about this rabble. You're talking about these people who keep complaining and moaning. And you say, no, I loved you. I've always loved you. You think, this is staggering. God's stunning love for these people, in spite of what a mess they were.
Yes.
And then you even come to the land when they say, right, now you can enter in. And they say, we can't, it's too difficult. And then God says, and then he says, but I will fulfill my purpose. So again and again, in spite of first Moses' failure, then the people's failure, it's God's faithfulness that's going to bring them through. And that's how it is for us.
Yes.
I mean, how many times we feel, I can't do this.
Yes.
I'm hopeless, or they're hopeless, or, my house group, this is a pain. They won't, we can meet difficulties, setbacks.
Yes.
And I found even writing, I'd sometimes come to a chapter, I don't know how to do this. And I actually found for myself, no, come on. Moses believed, you can do this, you can do this. And I don't feel myself a gifted writer, so I'd often kind of hit a stone wall and think, no, I can do this. And then sure enough, I'd find, here it comes, I can do it. And that's how it is in life. We find God's faithful, and God takes us through. And I think there are many stories in the story of Moses that remind us of God's phenomenal faithfulness. And our weakness, our vulnerability, but how faithful God is.
I suppose that Moses' story is in that case a good example of someone being gradually conformed to the image of Christ. He's at the start of his story very much raw material. By the end of his story, there's a much higher degree of conformity. He looks like the God he's serving more. He's experiencing. There's points. It seems almost as though his experience of leadership, leading the people, has got parallels with God's experience of leading the people. And I suppose I'm just curious about your experience. I imagine as a parent, there must be a lot of parallels. But I think just pastoring, overseeing lots of leaders and churches, for people who are watching this, who are leaders, part of the journey of growing as a Christian, let alone as a leader, will involve some of the meekness that I suppose Moses is famous for. Could you talk a little bit about that? How does that work for us? Is it learning to see things through God's perspective that Moses has to do? It gives him, I suppose, greater ability to carry other people who are needy, who don't understand him, who aren't looking out for him, and he's got to look out for them.
Yeah.
Leadership is often like that, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's. I love digging into the word, because you do find exactly that. It's fun. I remember when I was talking about reading books earlier. I remember reading initially. I mean, there were paperbacks about Hudson Taylor, but when I first started reading, there were two big fat books.
Yes.
And one was called The Growth of the Soul of a Man, and the next one was called The Growth of a Work of God.
Yeah.
And the first one was effectively how this young man was getting to know God, and then of course this phenomenal movement that grew. And you feel with Moses all the time, he's got his personal, it grows through his story, his personal passion to know God. That never goes away. So quite late on, he's saying, "Show me your glory." Yeah. And he's never going to be just a worker. He's never going to just get this job done, get these slaves out of here, march them down to the promised land. He's got a fascination for God that's profound in him. And as such, he gets to know God more and more. And so much God defends him. He gets attacked.
Yes.
And he says, "Hey, how dare you? I speak to prophets through visions and dreams, But this man, I speak face to face. You think, wow, you know, he's in the presence of God often. He comes up with his face shining.
Yes.
And so this massive privilege of Moses getting to know God, and then increasingly, as you say, becoming almost, he becomes like God to the people.
Yes.
And that gets tested. You know, the people start, even his sister and brother say, who do you think you are? And yet God says he's the meekest man on the earth.
Yes.
But how dare you say you're special? He doesn't say special, but God, he's got this relationship with God, and he's got immense patience in the end with the people. And he pleads for the people when God says enough of them. And you get these extraordinary stories where almost like God's fed up with the people, but Moses is for them. You think, wow, what a wonderful transition God has brought about. Yeah. When at first, when God says to Moses, I want you to do this, he says, oh, they won't believe me. It's like he's got no time for the people. But in the end, he's so for the people. And of course, it's God has put that into him.
Yes.
And so he in interceding and becoming a mediator, and he's a type of Christ, really. Yeah. That Christ comes to be with us and to stand for us and to stand alongside us and plead on our behalf. Yeah. And Moses, he's growing all the time in his personal knowledge of God. And it's very important for us as leaders that we're not just workmen, we're not just trying to get a job done. Yes. And it's in as much as we still have an ongoing passion to know Jesus and to long to meet with him more, that we're useful to him. Yes. If we lose that, I love John Piper's book title, Brothers, We Are Not Professionals, written to ministers. Oh, it's a brilliant book. Yes. And God forbid we just become professional ministers. No, we want to be people who have a passion for God. Yes. And Moses exemplifies that, absolutely.
Yes. It's necessary, I suppose, to see a journey at the heart of calling, that there's a journey, a development, a progression, and it's a relationship that you're growing with the people that you're leading. It's interesting that, like you say, he mirrors Jesus. I get struck by the fact that Jesus had similar. It says Jesus learned obedience through suffering. You think, how could Jesus learn anything? But he did learn in the sense that it wasn't easy, I suppose. And he at points even shows the pain by saying, how long must I be with you? Having to lead people like us for the Son of God. What a strange calling. And yet at the same time you see a growing love for the brothers, love for these men, and trust in them, confidence in them, and in spite of everything, a desire to be with them. And it's not because he didn't love them before, but it's like a relationship's grown, it seems. And it's kind of, I think for leaders who are watching this, I imagine it's tempting often to find the delayed gratification of leadership quite disappointing and exhausting and unthanked, sometimes not noticed and carrying a lot. But to know that, God's in that. He's actually doing something in us that's very important in the journey is a good reminder. It's helpful. So I find it so valuable. And of course, Moses is a mediator. You towards the end of the book, you bring out the fact, and this is a spoiler, but you're bringing us back to the Mount of Transfiguration, that Moses stands with Jesus at that mountain. Identified with Jesus in a powerful way. Could you share a bit more about this way that Moses features in the story?
Well, it's interesting that it says in Luke's Gospel that they were talking about the Exodus which Jesus was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And you think, well, he was going to die. But the actual text says the Exodus, not the. It says departure in some of our translations. It's the Exodus. It's the same word that Moses. And of course, the New Testament, the whole story really of the Bible is about deliverance from slavery and going into an inheritance. And so, yeah, the story of the gospel is very, very similar to the story of the Old Testament, and being brought out from slavery, going through a journey, inheriting the new heavens and the new earth that lay before us. And so, yeah, they could talk about that Exodus he was about to accomplish, where he's going to become our Passover. He's going to shed his blood. He's going to make a way for us and take us into death and into resurrection, like through the Red Sea and out into freedom. So all of these images in the story of Moses have their ultimate fulfillment in Christ. And so for Moses, it's amazing, really. It's an extraordinary thing that the disciples are there on this mountaintop, and then Elijah and Moses appear, and it says they're discussing these things together. It's an extraordinary thing that Moses, who's not allowed to go into the land earlier in the actual account, the story, he wants to go into the land, but the one time he blows it, loses his temper with the people, and God says, you're not going in. And in a sense, he represents the law, Moses and the law. That's how but it's like the law could never take you into everything. So Moses, in a sense, he can't take us all in because he's the law. He can only take you so far, and then he can't take you through. But in resurrection life, he's in there with the rest of us. So Moses, I think, I thought, this is great. I can finish the whole book with him there through the New Testament story. Because in the Old Testament story, I mean, he takes it amazingly. There's no answer from Moses initially. He says, you're not going in. But then later, I think it's in Deuteronomy, he said, please, can I go in? And no, you can't go in. But get Joshua ready. And that whole thing of raising up another leader, lay hands on him, instruct him. And that's part of our responsibility as leaders, to be looking for other leaders. You see that in the 70 in the story too. 70 others take some of the spirit that's on Moses and put it onto them. Obviously the mighty Holy Spirit, but I love that. The spirit that was on Moses comes on them. And you get the same with Elijah and Elisha. Where's the spirit of Elisha? There's something about the engagement of God with a person that somehow there's a passing on. Obviously it's the Holy Spirit, but God's happy to use that language. And they get filled with the Spirit. So, yeah, we also get in the book the fact of multiplied leadership. Not just the one man, although Moses is obviously the key figure. You also get, Jethro, when he tells Moses, what are you doing it like this for? You got a whole queue of people coming to you. And so Moses is willing to take his counsel, which is one part of the meekness of the man. And so ministry is multiplied. You begin to be a body. I think we can see New Testament church again and again in this story. I was just shocked. Oh, that's another New Testament story hidden away in the desert with Moses, and yet ever so relevant to us. About raising up leadership, giving people their various gifts. He says to Jethro, you can be eyes for us. It's like you've got a specific role that help us to accomplish. And, in a church, we're saying, there are gifts, come on, let's hear what... I love the way your meetings that I listen to often on a Sunday, and someone who's just winding up the meeting says, oh, by the way, God spoke to one of our people during the meeting, and this is what God is saying. You think, hallelujah. These are, this is a body functioning together. And you get that with Moses. There is in the Old Testament.
It's the way that his meekness is shown is partly in what we've been talking about a few minutes ago, the long-suffering, the sort of gentleness in praying for the people who've given him a headache for years.
Yes, quite.
I always remember that Baxter thing about these people give me a headache, and God says, come up into the mountain, I'll give you a couple of tablets.
Priceless.
Yeah. But he just that constant aggro, and the way he's just gentle and just praying for, at the best, the way we've been talking about. But also there's a meekness in the way he's willing. And what you're just saying is so important, that a leader of greatness is going to be the one that's most able to take it when someone says, you're doing it all wrong. And I always... love that story of Jethro coming to, but it's only recently someone told me how funny it is the way he talked. That Jethro's opening line to Moses is, "What you are doing is not good."
Yes.
It's like, that's pretty harsh. It's not. He's not, trying to win friends and influence people.
Yes.
It's the way. I've never had a consultant come to me and just start the presentation. The PowerPoint. What you're doing is not good. And they usually try and win you over.
I always feel that Moses could say, "See the face? I was just talking to him.
Yes,
Do you
right.
think he might not have mentioned it to me?"
My face is shiny.
Yes.
Yeah. I can't. What I'm amazed at is that he receives the counsel so willingly, and yet he doesn't. Well, it's so fascinating. I remember you saying this, that he doesn't capitulate to Jethro's advice. He doesn't sort of say, "Oh well, you're cleverer than me." He still retains his spiritual authority. So there's a lesson there, isn't there? That humble, constant learning, constantly being prepared to be the stupidest person in the room, and surrounding yourself with people who are much wiser, but not yielding if God's called you to spiritual authority.
It's very important.
And he does that perfectly, doesn't he? So he doesn't say to Jethro, who do you think you're talking to? But neither does he say, perhaps you could lead.
That's right.
I'll sit at the back. But he does it. He gets this balance. Remember you saying, imagine Jethro saying, and this whole thing about the cloud, very primitive. I've got maps.
Yes.
But he doesn't do that. He just sort of, yet Jethro honors and serves Moses' calling. He says, "No, you're the guy with the promises. I need to follow you. But I'll bring my gift." And it's such a lesson, isn't it?
They're still following the cloud. I mean, it's God's authority and God's call on Moses. So it's God who's leading them. And so, as you say, Moses has got the humility to hear him, but doesn't hand over. You're making such an important point.
Yeah. And it is. I occasionally hear very helpful comments from wise leaders who've built things over years and years, who say you have to get used to being the stupidest is probably a strong way to put it, but not being the smartest guy in the room. Just being that. Just that's part of your calling. You mustn't be intimidated by people who are sharp and got tremendous insight and skill, and bring it in from outside like a Jethro. I know that you've modelled that in the way that you've led team over the years.
I think at the very early days for me as a young pastor, I may have been still in my 20s, maybe just 30-ish. And we were having our first baby. And I went into the hospital with Wendy, and the nurses said to me, "Nothing's going to happen tonight. Go home, Mr. Virgo. Call in the morning. We'll tell you when to come in." So in the morning, I called in quite early, something like 7 or 8 in the morning. I just phoned in and said, I'm calling in. When do you think things might start happening again? When should I come in?
I was never allowed to go home with my kids. It's a different time.
I'd
love to have gone home. They wouldn't let me.
I spent plenty of hours waiting for people to turn up. And they said, "Oh, Mr. Virgo, you've had a baby boy." It started at 4 o'clock. It all happened, and we did. It's 4 in the morning. It's all's well. They've got a lovely little boy. You must come in. And I said, thank you. I put the phone down in those days. And I was leaning against the wall. I thought, wow, I've got a baby boy. I've got a son. This is amazing. And as I stood there, the front door rang, and I opened the door. There was a lady in our church. And she had a little parcel in her hand. And she said, "This is for your baby boy." I said, "I beg your pardon?" No one even knew that I'd taken Wendy into hospital the night before. It was unknown. "This is for your baby boy." And I said, how did you know? I said, "Oh, God woke me up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I was praying for Wendy." I thought I was sleeping for Wendy, She said, "I was praying for Wendy. This is for your baby boy." And I then said to her, "Well, you know God a lot better than I do." And I began to yield ground in a way that became very unhelpful to that person. Because as the months and then the years slipped by, I ceased to be a proper pastor to her.
Yes.
And I let her extraordinary prophetic gift
Yes.
assume an authority
Yeah.
which did her no good at all.
Yes. Exposed.
And in the end,
Yeah.
she sadly really drifted quite badly.
Right.
Well, I should have said, yeah, wonderful, that's really terrific, but still held the role that God had given me. And I learned a lot through that experience of, what wonderful gift, amazing. But, I needed not to think, oh, I must listen to her every time now. She's got the wisdom. She's got the wisdom. I mean, that was a young pastor, but I learned that lesson there.
Yes, yes. We misunderstand humility, don't we?
Well, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and it's. I remember again here over the years you talked about people who, from their outward manner, you wouldn't give them high marks for humility. But when you get close, you realise that's the only word for them, because that's actually what they really are. They're not trying to look humble. They might come across actually incredibly courageous and risk-taking and strong leaders. But the wonderful thing, the more wonderful still, is that behind all that, there's a genuine fear of God. In some cases, we perhaps we sort of misapply it, thinking humility means that you can't be a strong leader. Well, not necessarily. It might in some cases, the wrong kind of strength. But there's also a Moses strength, which is real meekness, which is a huge lesson and a secret that we need to grow in. I'm sort of loath to close things because I'd love to talk more about so many things, and there's all kinds of other highlights in this book. Just even as I'm thinking now about the parting of the sea and the song that Moses sings. I remember you reading that to us as kids at the breakfast table and literally singing it. just made up a tune and sang it. But it is funny how things like that kind of burn in your memory, just the sense of God's presence as we kind of did that. And it's quite something to have the song that Moses sang about his deliverance, the horse and the rider he's thrown into the sea, and think this is an archaic, strange poem from a weird, mystical man from thousands of years ago, and actually it's life to me today. Because what he's singing about is how definitive is the deliverance of God.
Amen.
The things that look impossible to overcome, our addictions and habits, our hang-ups and insecurities, and all the things that we struggle with, our mental health issues and multiple things that just seem insurmountable. The honest truth is that God's deliverance is complete, that Jesus has died and risen, and we're raised with him.
Amen.
I know that's a big theme for you. We're running out of time, but perhaps you could share a little bit more about that theme of how great, how complete is our salvation. The way that Paul picks this up in Romans chapter 6.
Absolutely.
Part of your teaching.
Well, I think Romans 6, as Paul speaks it out about our deliverance as Christians, as Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones says, the most releasing chapter in the whole Bible. It's built on the story of the Red Sea crossing, I believe. And talking about, these guys, they'd known through the Passover, instead of judgment, they'd known forgiveness. All around them, every household, a child had died, that none of their children died. They'd been forgiven, they'd been accepted through the lamb that had died in the place of the child. The blood covered them. And yet, as they come to the Red Sea, they're still trapped. And I know as a young Christian, that's exactly how I felt. I thought, thank you for forgiving me. Thank you. Yeah, I'm saved from judgment, but I still feel I can't get out. There's stuff, all sorts. I'm like a slave to all kinds of things in my life. And it was a revelation of Romans 6, which I believe is the story of crossing. They went down into the Red Sea and came up the other side. We've been crucified. We've been buried with Christ in baptism, raised to newness of life. And I remember it came to mind, how many Egyptian soldiers got through the Red Sea? Not one.
Yes,
And,
yes.
you know, sometimes when Satan says to you, I've got you,
Yes.
you know, you're forgiven, but you're my captive.
Yes.
And I think many of us go through that. That's exactly how I felt. I thought, I'm just a captive.
Yes.
And then I suddenly saw, no, he that has died is freed from sin.
Yeah.
And I wow, I'm through it. I'm out. And it was a revelation that changed my life. And I believe that that's the story of the Red Sea crossing. I love it when Moses says they sank like lead. It's like, yeah. And it's such a shout of triumph.
Yes, yes.
And we're free.
Yes.
And I think for every believer to celebrate that, comes out in the book. There's a whole chapter on that. Hey, there's a freedom that we can enjoy, just like they did, because of what Jesus did. Jesus had done it.
Yes.
He's made us free.
Yes.
And so important for us to know that our deliverance through what Christ accomplished on the cross, his death and his resurrection, we've been justified. We've also been released from the power of Satan through the cross.
Yes, yes, yes. Another passage that I'm particularly keen to touch on is the story of how the battle is fought with Amalek, the Amalekites, and Joshua in the valley with the army, taking on the very immediate kind of military challenge with real swords and real enemies and real fighting on the line. And Moses is up in the mountain with his hands raised in prayer, with Aaron and Hur helping him. It's such an instructive passage, isn't it? Because we in leadership, we're often faced with the dilemma or the assumption of a kind of polarity between these things. That there's either the spiritual approach of just depending on the Lord, just praying, or there's the practical approach, which is to do the real work. And you know, who do you think you are praying up there when we've got real battles to fight, real enemies? And it's funny how you can feel that on an individual level. You feel the pressure of, am I doing the right thing? Am I giving my time to the right thing? And shouldn't I be praying more? Shouldn't I be getting busy out there more? And even within a team, you know, I noticed you weren't at the prayer meeting, or I noticed you weren't helping us practically when we needed, you were busy praying. And yet the reality is Scripture clearly in this passage, as well as many others, shows the way these things are interdependent and important together. And you've learned that lesson practically in ministry as well from your own story.
Yes, I think that story for me is very instructive. For my experience was that as a young Christian, the pastor of the Baptist church I attended always referred to that story and talked about, we're going to pray. We used to pray on Saturday. We're going to pray, and tomorrow I will kind of clear up what we won tonight.
Yes, yeah.
And he'd use that imagery of raising up the hands. You're going to help me tomorrow when I preach, and so that imagery was always with me. And it's one of the things that has really, I think, had a big impact on my confidence in prayer. Prayer is such a vital thing. That a church like prayer is a powerful church. I believe it with all my heart. And put my emphasis there. I was so delighted when we really built a prayer meeting, and because I knew that things were accomplished. It was only more recently, a few years ago, I came back to that story again, and I just noticed what I'd never noticed before, that Moses said to Joshua, take fighting men, or some such phrase, and then I'll go and pray. And I thought, oh, fighting men. I've never noticed. It's almost like I had got to the place where the men in the valley didn't really matter because it was quite clear that when Moses had his hands raised, they won. When Moses got tired, they lost. Yeah. So the whole battle, that's the battle. And I just felt God arrested my attention. Take fighting men. It's not like it doesn't matter what's happening there.
Yes, yeah.
It was, no, you need some fighters. Yeah. Some people are going to have to fight. Yes. You're going to have to get stuck in and work. And I remembered back to when we had the battle for this building, and we were told you can't have it. And we prayed like anything and put in our appeal. But it occurred to me, even as I was thinking about that, actually we put in the very best appeal you could have. You know, we worked hard at the appeal. We got good legal advice. It wasn't that we just prayed. You know, we put in a very good appeal,
yes.
but then we prayed like anything, because we've been told, don't waste your time with an appeal. There's no way you're going to turn this thing around. Yeah. And so it was a combination. And I think we can. I think you put it very well. You can drift one way or the other.
Yeah.
And I feel if we say all we do is pray, you know, you almost become like monks in a monastery. You don't have anything to do with anything. You just pray. You just, and yet, so often it's the other way, where people have their plans and say, oh, will you just pray? Yeah. Oh, God, please bless our plans. Okay, thank you for praying. Right, let's get on with it. Yeah. It's like, it's all our deal. Yeah. And I think that combination of being responsible, doing the best we can, and then leaning heavily into God. Because in the end, you've got to, unless the Lord builds the house, we labor in vain. We've got to see God's activity. And so, both are very important. And I think that comes out in the story of Amalek. I hope I brought it out in the book. But certainly we've got a whole chapter on that conflict and that importance of prayer. And I think I illustrated in the book from the battle that we fought here.
Yes, absolutely. And it's about the fact that it's fighting talk. It's a warrior atmosphere amongst those heroes that we see in Scripture. You point out there's a kind of slight preponderance of soldiers, as it were. Certainly people who knew what it was to fight. As opposed to some kind of traditions where the heroes are all philosophers, academics. Actually, the Bible's heroes are people who had to push through things and win battles and get scars and take ground, and which in itself is pretty revealing. Yeah,
even Nehemiah, who wanted to be a builder, had to have a sword as well.
Yeah. It's I think as a leader to be reminded that we're called to a fight. It's described in those terms so often. You know that it's easy to perhaps. Ironically, in spite of the fact we've gone through a difficult season, we still live in a relatively affluent context compared to the heroes of the book, and just the reminder regularly that this is called a good fight. It will help us, won't it, to get kept away from the dangerous complacency. Well, I think we'll draw it to a close, but I've so appreciated this, and we could go on and on and on, and normally we do, but today we can't, and so I'm going to finish the interview here and simply recommend that you get hold of your copy of God's Treasured Possession as soon as possible from Amazon or from any good Christian bookshop. It's available also on Kindle, and you're going to be so helped and encouraged and instructed as you read it and reflect on it and get it for somebody else as well. It's a superb resource. Thank you so much for being with us, and we've really appreciated you being part of this leadership video.
Thank you, Joel. It's been fun. I've really enjoyed it.